and our online audience too. There's quite a few people signed up today. So we're a hybrid event. Yeah, great to see you all. And we're going to be talking about getting started with systems innovation today. And I'm going to stop actually as I go through. We've got a bit of time, so I'm going to stop as I go through to welcome any questions, and we can have a bit of a discussion as we go along. And also, Ben, you might want to pick up stuff online. Yeah, so some of you know me. I set up systems innovation about 6-7 years ago. I've done a lot of teaching of systems thinking and complexity theory. And then about 3 years ago, I set up our community, or kind of shifted from being an e-learning platform to being more of a community, which we are today. And I've been working a lot on that. So running events, setting up hubs, and generally building that community and thinking about how we might do systems innovation, right? The big tricky one. We're not very good at it at this stage. How can we build people's capacity, individuals, organizations, even society's capacity to do systems innovation in response to the wicked challenges? And this is kind of what I'll be talking about today. This guide was, I produced this actually very recently, a couple of weeks ago, about a month ago, in recognition that a lot of people are interested in this subject, but they find it a bit abstract. And there's a whole part of ideas, the systems thinking, and collaboration and networks and all of this. They don't really know where to start. So I produced this guide as a way to help people just clarify like what this stuff is and give a few examples, because people are always asking for examples. They find it very abstract, right? And they want some examples. So I'm going to give some of those. Well, let me just flick through here. We're going to talk about what systems innovation is, try and make that as kind of tangible as possible. Some examples. And then methods. How do we actually go about doing this stuff? So that's what we're going to talk about. I'll stop as we go through to make sure we're all on the same page and you're up to date. How do you guys feel about your understanding of all this stuff? Do you think you're a beginner? Put your hands up if you're a beginner with all of this stuff. Okay, we've got maybe a third, or is it half? Medium to advanced. Do you think you're more advanced? Okay, good. The middle. Okay, so we're kind of a mix, half in middle advanced, half at beginners here. Great. Okay, so let's jump in. So what is systems innovation? Just to kind of clarify that mystery a little bit. I think this whole thing really starts with these ideas of wicked problems. Have you heard of wicked problems? How many people? That's quite a well-known word, a wicked problem. I think it starts with an interest in what's going on out there in the world, the kind of broader view of the world, and some kind of consideration or concern about these major challenges that are going on in our world beyond our own little problems we have in our own life. So some of these examples of those: financial crisis. These are what we call wicked problems. I'll explain in a minute what I mean by wicked problems. But just to kind of start with this reality, which is kind of the world we live in, right? These very complex, we call them wicked problems, and these are some examples: financial instability, inequality, water crisis, urban sprawl in mega cities around the world, cybersecurity, political paralysis, climate change is normally the one that people kind of pull out first, but there's a whole host of them. Soil erosion. Any others? Any other ideas what a wicked problem might be? Any other examples? Last time I asked this one, and a lady came up with an asteroid hitting the planet, and I was like, how did you think of that? Any other ideas? What a wicked problem? Of an example of a wicked problem. Acidification of the ocean. Yep, yep. So acidification of the ocean was one. Homelessness. Say again? Homelessness, yeah, in many ways it is, right? And we might look around us here in London. We know that that's a problem we haven't really solved. There's a whole part of organizations trying to solve it. And I was in San Francisco a couple of years ago, and wow, it's amazing. I mean, there's people everywhere on the street, and that's a very wealthy, very competent, so on and so forth society. But they haven't been able to solve that. Looks like a pretty simple, it's just people on the street. It looks pretty simple, but they haven't been able to solve that problem. That's quite interesting. Any others? Poverty, yeah, in some ways. I mean, it's a very big idea. But yeah, any others? Uh, Food insecurity, yeah. Yeah, that's an interesting one, isn't it? Because it's not a single thing, is it? It's quite a complex issue, really. There's money involved there, there's government sort of stuff, there's obviously food, there's environmental factors and so forth. And it's not like we can just grow all our own food here, is it? It's like people are still going to want bananas, aren't they? And they're still going to want things that aren't here. So it's not that simple, and we haven't really solved it. So yeah, okay. So just to jump into what a wicked problem kind of is, really. I mean, why are they so difficult? Why can't we solve things like homelessness or inequality or stuff like this? And it really comes down to this difference between, well, simple things and complex things, and the fact that complex things are fundamentally different from simpler things. So maybe you've heard of complexity science. It's a science of complex systems, and we wouldn't have a science of complexity if kind of approaches for simpler systems worked for complex systems, ways of understanding them or ways of tackling them and so forth. And there is a fundamental difference between the two. I can't go into it today because it's pretty fundamental. When we talk about challenges, simpler ones, we call them tame problems. They look something like this. There's a problem, and there can be a solution to that. So if you have a puncture on your car, or you have a toothache, that's a problem, right? You'd call that a problem. I have a problem, my car's it's got a puncture, my tooth aching, and you say to yourself, there is a solution to this. I know there's a solution to this. And you'd go to the mechanic and he would fix that problem. Or you go to the dentist and he would fix the problem. And that's a simple problem. And there is a solution to it. And that's a tame problem. Some of these other ones, well, they aren't like that at all. Inequality. There's no garage you can take your society and it's going to fix your inequality. Or what would be a good example of this? Climate change, or food would be good examples of this, or water. There's a water crisis in Cape Town. And if you go and dig into complex, wicked problems, quite often they might look like this. They might say, oh, there's a problem. People can't get water in Cape Town, so there must be a solution to it. That's the way people think. But if you really go and investigate the situation, you say, okay, yeah, there's water here somewhere. Here it is. You go digging into that problem and you realize, actually, it's not a problem with water. There's water, but there's environmental factors, right? The way we're using land, the way we're growing food, or design, right? 30%, 40% of it leaks out of the pipes. Or actually government, there's no incentive for them to fix this problem, really. Or there's something to do with energy, or there's just not enough money here, or economics, incentives, education. So that's the thing with a complex wicked challenge. When you pull on one part, you actually find that it's interconnected with a whole pile of other systems. And that's why it's so difficult. That's why there's nothing like this. You can't just go and fix the problem. Some people call them messes, actually. I mean, that's a mess, right? And that's the reality of what a wicked problem looks like. It really looks like that. Hey. So those are the messes we're dealing with. And these are some of the aspects of wicked problems. So you think about actually the one in the news at the moment, these shootings in America. That's quite bizarre. Children going into schools and killing other children. Like, can't we just fix that? Shouldn't you be able to fix that problem? And when you pull on that problem, you start to see a whole pile of other things behind it, right? Politics, culture, so on and so forth. Look at this one here, perspective, right? We know there's very different perspectives on that issue. Some people think they should have guns, some people think they shouldn't, so on and so forth. As opposed to your toothache or your puncture. Everybody knows it's just a puncture, right? There's not like many different perspectives on that or anything. So that's a problem with wicked. That's the aspect of wicked problems, multiple conflicting opinions on the nature of the challenge, which makes it very difficult for people to get together and go and do something about them. They're multidimensional. There's many social, economic, technological, environmental factors. They're interconnected. Every wicked challenge is connected and interdependent with many others. open-ended. There's no kind of fixed point where, like with the car puncher, you can say once he's fixed it, they've fixed it. I'll do it in a day. It'll be done. Climate change, right? We're never going to fix that. I mean, it's just, that's going to go on and on. So it's open-ended. It's unstructured, which is an important part of it. Climate change is going to, it basically affects every borough in this city. So it cuts across all those different departments. It's going to cause things like flooding. And flooding is just going to go like that. It's going to be every building. It's going to be every part of the city. So actually it cuts across a whole pile of departments. And that's a big problem. Because normally we fix problems, like if there's an energy problem, we fix it there. If there's a technical problem, we do it like that. We fix them in departments. When they cut across departments, we have a whole pile of problems working together and so forth. There's no known solution. It means we've never had this situation before. Global cybersecurity is a major issue. We've never been in this situation before of having this vast information system around the planet that we're all interconnected with and dependent upon for running, you know, our entire lives almost. So there's no solution. There's no known solution. We've never been there before. So those are wicked problems. And that's where we're kind of starting. We're saying, okay, that's all very scary, really, isn't it? What are we going to do about that? If kind of traditional approaches, I mean, the whole point is that traditional approaches don't really work, is what I'm trying to say here. We have a kind of set of tools as to how to fix problems. They don't really work in this context because of the nature of wicked problems. And we're saying, is there a different way? And we're saying, yeah, what we've got to do actually is kind of change the system instead of changing the parts, because that's really the defining feature about wicked problems. They're systemic, which means it's not one part of the system. So this is an energy system. Transition to a whole new energy paradigm, a sustainable energy paradigm, a decarbonized energy system, is not one part of that system. Basically how we move, how we heat, how we do everything with respect to energy is combustion of fossil fuels. So it's basically everything here has to change. It's the system that needs to change, not one part of it. And our traditional approaches are good at fixing one part. That example of the car, it's one part of the car that we can isolate and we can fix the problem. Inequality is not really like that. It's not one part of our society. It's actually a whole networked way of that we interact across different systems, social and economic. Corruption in India would be another example. It's a social network within which people are interacting and so forth. It's not one part of the system. It's not just the president who's corrupt. It's the whole kind of system. So that's really the challenge, right? That it's actually the system and not the parts. And we're saying we need to do something different here. We need to actually figure out how to change the system. Kind of a crazy idea, really. We've been doing a lot of this, right? We're super good at this, very good at making products, very good at changing things. We really haven't got a clue how to change systems. We don't really understand them. We're not really looking at the world like that. You know, we normally look at the world in this kind of compartmentalized view, and then how to actually change them is, well, we go about it in the way that we normally do. We try to change all the parts, which is extremely ineffective when you're trying to change a system. So that's where all this starts, right? Saying, is there an approach, a better approach to changing systems than the traditional approach where we just try and change all these parts? And that's systems change or systems innovation. So this is it, kind of getting to the end of this first bit about what systems innovation is. It's saying it's innovation. Is innovation, lots of definitions, but you could say it's the value-adding process of creating and applying new ideas towards changing things. And we normally do this, we know what innovation looks like. It's innovation in parts, the whole pile of that, right? I was giving that example of San Francisco, right? The mecca of innovation, innovation in parts, right? A whole pile of apps and a whole pile of electric cars and, you know, data products and so forth. And it's this kind of technical, we call it reductionist kind of approach to innovation. We find a specific solution to a problem, like fixing that puncture on our car. We're very good at that. And even very complicated things like finding new materials for our clothes that would make them water resistant or something. It's kind of an algorithmic thing. And then we create a product out of that and we take it to market and we try and change the world by producing a whole pile of iPhones and so forth. And that has an effect, that does things, right? It definitely changes things. But it's not really the way that you go about changing systems. You got to do something different. And this is what we're saying here. There's a different way of doing innovation. Yeah, we want to take new ideas and we want to apply them to changing things in the world, but we want to change systems instead of changing parts. So we're saying there's this whole area of systems thinking, and maybe we use that understanding. That would be the ideas behind this kind of innovation, be a new way of looking at the world, new way of looking at systems so that we could start to organize them in different ways and change the system instead of changing, you know, products and services and things all the time. So that's that, guys. Do you have any questions or comments on any of that? Do you have a basic? Yep. Yeah. Yeah, we'll get into that now. We'll get into it. Yeah, a little bit ahead. Yep.
I'm wondering, have you ever seen an attempt in a mathematical model to describe the probability of influencing the system, let's say by changing different parts? Something, when I see these things, a lot of times comes to me some sort of quantum equation, for example, where you have probabilities of things resulting versus Newtonian mechanics of what would be a Tame problem, as you call it. So I'm wondering whether you have, perhaps there's something that it's known and misused, or I'm not sure. I've never seen something that
a probability of the a part changing the system.
It would be basically the probability of influencing the whole system described as with a certain mathematical manner by changing different parts of it.
Yeah, I'm not sure mathematics is really the right approach to this, really. I mean, we're talking about innovation, and this is something very open. I mean, a lot of mathematical equations and so forth are describing closed systems that have certain determinism to them also. Here, this is a very, very open thing. There's a whole pile of things you have to connect. Like if we really wanted to tackle inequalities growing here in the UK, or poverty is a good example here in London. It's higher than the rest of the UK. It's about 27%. A lot of people living in poverty. If you really wanted to change that situation, many different ways of doing it, right? That's the first thing. And it's a very open problem. There's so many things you'd have to actually connect and move and change and do in different ways. Yeah.
But that would be the point, right? There's things that would have very little influence, even if you change them. And other parts have a very high influence.
Yeah, but there's a whole set of things you have to change is the point, right? That's really the essence of this simple versus complex. And the simple thing, fixing the punches, is just one thing you have to change. When we think in systems, we think holistically about actually there's a problem here, but it's held in place by this here, that there, that there, that there. The whole pile of combination of things that have to change. Messy is kind of the world. This is the real world where there's a whole pile of possibilities and ways of putting things together. So it's quite different from mathematics, where we're quite often talking about closed systems that we can understand. But maybe it's a conversation for another day. Yep.
Just a comment on this one, and I think that a middle point between your two viewpoints is like network science within social sciences. They are doing what you're saying, but using more of a social sciencey approach within statistics. And also a comment on that, I think there are some techniques to model relationships, and you can actually calculate and create some automation, but it doesn't, it has limits, because there are bits in the system where actually, there's a human decision and then a human error at some point that you cannot anticipate. So on some big projects, they do some modeling up to a point in order to understand what's happening. But then it doesn't explain everything, and it cannot control
Exactly. But I think the network science is a good point. If you want to kind of, network science is part of complexity theory. If you want to understand a lot of complex systems, it's one of the best ways to do it. You know, there's a whole part of stuff you can do with network science. Any others? Should we stay going? Yep. Okay. So yeah, actually should have finished that. Like, what do you actually need to do systems innovation? I think there are definitely two parts here, right? You've got to change people's way of thinking because it's innovation, right? If there's no new ideas, then it's not innovation. And if it's not ideas or awareness that's coming from the systems level, then it's not systems innovation. So you've got to change the kind of thinking. Any kind of systems level innovation is going to require systems level awareness. For this, we need a new way of thinking. We call it systems thinking. How many people systems thinking have heard of that? Yeah, 1, 2, just 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay. Okay, that's something new to you. Okay, I'll talk a little bit about that. But more than thinking, right? Innovation is an applied thing. You have to, that's what I like about it. It's, you have to actually change something in the world, right? It's a good, I like it as a way to prevent me from sitting around talking and thinking all the time. You know, you can sit there philosophizing all the time. But if it's innovation, you're going to have to go and do something. You're going to have to change something out there in the world. But if we're not necessarily changing all the parts, what are we doing? We're changing the organization between those parts. That's generally what we're doing. Change the structure of that system, the way it's organized. I mean, I'll get into it now. Maybe that sounds a bit abstract, but I'll give examples and so forth. But just to say, like on a high level, like you have to change the thinking and you have to change the way it's organized. And that's really what we're trying to do in systems innovation. Okay, so how do we, well, some examples of that. And hopefully this kind of, a lot of people find this one useful. This is a general one, but just to get the idea. Say we want to decarbonize our cities, and we have lots of cities that want to do that. I think London is like 2030 or something. They're trying to get to net zero. Anyway, there's a couple of ways you can do that, right? You can focus on the parts and think about all these cars, and we've got to decarbonize them. We've got to shift them to electric vehicles and so forth. And that'd be one way of doing it. But the cars are part of a system, right? The city, and this city has a structure. Systems have structures. The way the parts are, the system is set of parts and interrelationships between those parts. So it has a structure. So we could think about maybe changing the structure of that city so that we don't really even need these cars so much, right? This is the idea of the 15-minute city. They're trying to, the mayor of Paris wants to introduce it. I see in Canary Wharf that they're talking about it also. But it's the idea that instead of designing cities where we separate everything out so that, you know, your children go to school up here and you do your office work here and your recreation there, and then you live over here and you drive for, you know, 2 hours every day. Maybe we restructured that. So it was a 15-minute city. You had everything you needed in 15 minutes, your children and your work and your food and so forth. You wouldn't need this thing so much. And the interesting thing is that that wouldn't really solve the problem. It would dissolve the problem. This solves the problem, right? So simple problems, there's a problem and there's a solution. Complex problems, there's not even a problem. There's a challenge, I call it. I never use the word problem because it's not really, it's a challenge. And there is no solution to that challenge. There's the potential that you dissolve the issue. So that's what we did here. We changed the structure of the system to actually dissolve the problem. The problem kind of goes away, right? We haven't got all these cars driving around anymore, potentially. So yeah, I'm not going to go into that. I just wanted to throw that up there so you get this. All I'm trying to do on a high level is illustrate this difference between changing parts and changing systems. And when we talk about systems change, we're talking about changing the structure of that system. So that's it. That's an example on a very high level, the 15-minute city. On a more down to earth, well, did that make sense to everyone? Did everybody get that idea? Or yeah, okay. So this is a real world example. That was kind of an abstract one. So Glasgow City has had a an issue with violent crime for almost 100 years or more than 100 years. It's been one of the most violent cities in Europe. Knife crime by young men, predominantly. So this has changed. Now Europe is considered, or Glasgow is considered, a European capital of culture, and crime violence has gone right down. And that's interesting. They weren't able to solve this problem for a very long time. It was a big issue, very ugly issue too. I don't know if you know much about it, but not a nice thing at all. And then the police have been taking a traditional approach to the issue for decades, which is just focusing on the individuals in that system and saying these are bad people and we need to capture them and we need to lock them up and punish them and so forth, and then they'll stop doing it. And they changed that approach in 2005. They created this violence reduction unit, and they started to look at this issue in a different way as more of a public health approach to violence. So this lady, McCluskey, came in and she said, let's look at this differently, right? Let's not focus on the individuals, but let's look at this more like a social network, because that's kind of what it is, right? These people are embedded within social, they're embedded in a context. They aren't individual people, isolated, and some of them are good randomly, and some of them are bad kind of randomly, and we just got to look up the bad people. Actually, they're part of the whole socio-economic, cultural, and environmental and technological, they're in a city context, and it's a network actually. And we're saying actually maybe it's that network that's creating these conditions the way these are, and things are spreading on the network. So we get this idea now that we've been through the pandemic with social distancing, that things spread on networks, and that can change the state of the individuals in those networks. So that's what she was saying here, that actually the way they're behaving is more the results of some phenomena spreading on network, and the structure of the networks, they're part of this. So they started to frame the challenge in a new way, seeing the issue as systemic, involving many different interacting factors. So it goes back to the point I was making there, right? Originally, they're just saying, oh, there's this problem of this person who's doing bad things, violence. And now she kind of complexified the whole thing. She said, well, it's not just that individual. Let's think about everything around that and what's going on and all those factors, and look at how those factors, that network, has created this condition. Then how might we work with all these people in housing, in health, in education, in employment, in family support services, in local community groups and businesses, and so forth, to try and shift the system, to try and change that context so that they don't end up in that environment, in that kind of network that induces them to take these actions and so forth. So that's another example. Hopefully it makes sense. I think it's a good one, actually, because it's a real one. Not too many good examples of systems change, but that's the essence of it, right? Shifting from focus on parts to focus on the system. Another one, maybe I'll skip forwards a little bit because I'm going a little bit slow, but another one here is Mexico City. So Mexico City, they used to have a big, massive reservoir outside the cities, and they'd pump the water into the city through a kind of industrial linear system, pipes and so forth. And even then, not everyone got water because they couldn't afford it. And then a number of years ago, they had a big earthquake, and that shattered a lot of those pipes. A lot of people, there was flooding, a lot of people without water and so forth. And coming out of this, they asked if there was a different way of doing it, or at least this organization asked if there was a different way of doing it. And they set up these rain harvesting, decentralized rain harvest systems in the poor neighborhoods, so that people had basins and pipes and a whole system. It's quite an agile system, getting to what we were talking about, or was it yourself? Sorry, yourself, in decentralized design, right? They designed these very agile systems that be these container things and pipes, so they could put them on the roof and capture the water. They could actually start trading each other also. And they became independent from this very cumbersome and somewhat expensive industrial age system, and managed to set up their own water system, because it rains a lot in Mexico, actually. Apparently the same as here in London. It's just that it pours down when it rains. So they're able to capture this and build their own water system, a decentralized system of low-tech basins and plumbing to capture water and channel it into their homes. And it started to create new kind of citizen engaging with each other and new kinds of relationships and new little economies in the communities for peer exchange of water and resilience. They're independent now from this centralized system. So those are examples. Yeah, that's just shifting from a centralized system to a more decentralized system. I'm going to talk about methods now, but are there any questions on that? Does that make sense? Do we see like the theory kind of expressed in those examples? Any questions, or generally happy? Okay. So talking about how we do this, how do we go about systems innovation? And there's a lot of different ways of doing this. There's a number of organizations like using these ideas like Climate Kick and UNDP and others. And there's a lot of different approaches. This is the one we've developed and are using at this time. It's a framework, and it has 4 dimensions to it. It starts off with that systems thinking, as mentioned. So you've got to think in systems by shifting our thinking from ecosystem thinking to ecosystem thinking. So just getting beyond seeing the individual parts in the system to thinking about it on the systems level, like that example of the 15-minute city. It's not kind of obvious that you'd do that, is it? That if you had these cars that are emitting CO2 and a climate crisis, what would you do? You'd fix those parts. That'd be level 1 thinking, right? Changing the structure of the city, most people wouldn't think about that, actually. That's not the way they think, because most of us we aren't very good. This is interesting. I've observed this a lot. We aren't good at seeing the context within which we exist. We just see things. I was talking to someone about behavioral economics. Who was it? Yes, so it's a very good example, right? The way that smart marketing people use the context we're in to manipulate us, right? When we go into the store, all we see is, oh, I'm going to get my milk here. But they've thought about the whole context they're in, right? And they've put the milk over there because they know that it's beside that thing that they want you to buy and so forth. And they're using that context. And we as people, we're very bad, as individuals, we're very bad at seeing the context. And that's why we need systems thinking, because it helps us think about the context, the whole context things are existing in. And when you see that context, you can do a very different kind of change, very different kind of innovation. And it's not magic. I mean, there's a whole area now of science. It's about 80 years old, systems thinking, a lot of books and academic stuff and so forth. So that's systems thinking, systems mapping. I'll go into this a little bit as we go through now, but systems mapping. So we've thought about the system differently. We've started to become aware of actually the whole thing instead of just the individual parts. But you've actually got to understand how this thing works a little bit. What are the parts in this? Like specifically, this is quite abstract, that systems thinking. This is more concrete. Like we go in and we say, okay, we have this city or we have this challenge here. What are actually the parts in that? And how are those parts interrelated? And then we map that out. And try and find places to intervene, because we actually have to change this thing. And think about what are those changes that need to take place. That's a coordinated set of changes or interventions we need to make. Right? It's not going to be one. It's going to be a network. And then we're going to have to make a number of changes in that network, like that police officer in Glasgow did. Right? So we find places we want to intervene and change, and then we've got to actually go and do it. Got to go and intervene and design, develop, create some new innovation, product, service, startup, or whatever, and connect those in the way that's needed, and then actually build this and go and develop it out there in the world. Scale the thing, grow an ecosystem of partners who want to work together, or startups or whatever it is, entrepreneurs, organizations, and go and change system. I think that Glasgow example is a good example of that, because that's what they did. So that's just some general dimensions of what you need to do if you want to change a system. in pretty much any area that can be applied. And it can be on any different kind of time scale, right? It could be, well, we run workshops where we take those ideas and iterate through them very quickly. We have a canvas in an hour or 2 hours to get for people to start ideating, put the challenge in the center there. And then, I don't know if I have it on the next page, put the challenge in the center and start ideating quickly. How would I think about a system? How would I map it? What are the changes that need to take place? How would we build an ecosystem? So forth. You can do that in an hour or two. Obviously, you're not going to change the system, but you're going to get an idea of, you're going to start thinking about it. You could do things, you know, in a week or two. You could run something like a lab that might last 6 months. If you're really going to do it properly, it'll probably take you 10 years or so. Well, definitely 5 years plus. To build some kind of an ecosystem, some kind of a collaborative network for people to work together and start to change the system. So that's just looking at different time horizons. Yeah, and that's kind of a canvas we use. So systems thinking. This is about changing our thinking. We'll surely need to be thinking in systems to be able to do this. What is systems thinking? Well, it's the opposite from analytical reductionist thinking, where we're focusing on the part, where we're taking things apart and decomposing them and understanding how they function based upon all the parts interacting. Like we take our bicycle to pieces like that. Holistic thinking is this. We take our bicycle, we don't take it apart, we put it into its context and we see how it interacts in that context. That's systems thinking. You're looking at the context and in absolutely everything, it's a mode of thinking, it's a paradigm. So every time you open your eyes, you're structuring all the information that comes in based upon your conceptual model, your paradigm. So you can look at a person, you can look at a computer, you can look at anything and think about it in this way. Focus on the individual person, what age are they, you know, the properties, what clothes are they wearing and so forth. Or you can put them into context and say, oh, who are their parents, or, you know, what's the environment they're in, so on and so forth. How do they interact with their environment? And this innovation will give you the technical kind of innovation we know well, because this dominates in modern kind of society. This gives you the systems change because you're looking at the whole kind of context and you're seeing new possibilities for changing the system. Yeah, I'll stay going. So trying to shift from kind of linear thinking, just a couple of causes creating this problem, to kind of complexifying that and looking at the whole cosmos of different factors affecting them. And yeah, we have a whole pile of canvases and tools for doing that. This is one example that we were working on around climate resilient cities and mapping out just the immediate kind of causes of that, but then going to the next level and thinking about the context around that. What are the different factors that are affecting these and that and so forth? And you see kind of bigger picture and so forth. Any questions on any of that? Or does it all make sense? Are you thinking about this in any particular context you have? Or anybody want to say a kind of challenge they're facing that they're interested in this in?
So I used to work in the government back in Mexico, and I found it really hard because the approach is quite like short term. So how can you introduce systems thinking or systems innovation when like apparently the most valuable is the short term, very specific, non-contextual intervention?
Maybe you're in the wrong context, maybe in the wrong environment, right? Maybe you need to create something new in the system, a new space for things to bring people together, right? Quite often, if you go inside organizations, you can have all sorts of constraints that exist already, time, energy, money, and so forth. That kind of organization is set up to try and tackle things through a very traditional kind of approach, right? Relatively simpler problems. That's why they don't really work very well. It's why we're in this room, right? Imagine if our governments knew how to tackle complex problems. We wouldn't be here. They'd be fixing the problem, right? Or corporations or whatever, right? We're here because the approaches they have are very linear and they don't work very well. So typically you have to create something new. You have to go outside the organization. That's why we say the kind of ecosystem approach is that you're not really working so much inside the organization. Maybe you're trying to change it a bit, but really you're creating a new space outside and bringing people together in new ways. And then you get to set some of the rules, at least in that, like the time horizon and so forth. Yeah.
How do you bridge between the two levels of thinking? So like there's the parts and the very like analytical thinking where I can measure this can or whatever. And then there's the systems thinking where we're using models and frameworks to map out new ideas and how the system might be done, but bridging the two, relating how does this can or this criminal in Glasgow relate to the larger context and actually creating that link. How is like communication problem is quite different. So I have a lot of questions.
Throwing ideas out. Well, yeah, that exists in many different contexts. But yeah, you're always trying to help people expand their view beyond just the individual path and say, okay, well, what's that connected to, and what's that connected to, and how are those things affecting this element itself? Yeah, so it is trying to expand people's perception, like I just showed there, right? That example of moving from linear thinking. That's the way most of us think, right? If there's a problem, we say, well, there's a cause, right? Obviously, there's got to be a cause to this problem. If there's a problem with our healthcare system, well, it's probably the boss up there at the top. He's wrong. We're going to get rid of him. Or maybe there's two things. Maybe it's the boss and there's not enough money. Or maybe three things. Maybe it's the nurses also. Their training's wrong, right? That's the way we think about problems, right? Whenever we see a problem, complex one, whether it's complex or simple, we normally say, oh, there's got to be a cause, and the cause is number one, number two, and maybe number three max. And that's the way we think about it, because that's kind of the simplest way to think about things, right? Because it makes sense, because that's the way systems work, right? There's always, if I open the door opened because I caused it to open, you know? And you're just trying to say, well, you're trying to show them that this doesn't work, right? After a while, initially they do this, and then after a while they figure out, well, this isn't really working. And you got to say, guys, it's not working because it's part of a system. And it's a system, it's a whole pile of stuff going on here, and there's a whole pile of stuff going on here, and there's a whole pile of stuff going on here. And you need to expand your view of what you're dealing with before you're going to be able to shift these things. These things are just going to stay in place as long as all this stuff is going on here. So that problem in Glasgow, that just stayed coming back, right? The police, you know, imagine how many people they arrested and how much money they put in and so forth, and it just stayed coming back. Because as that lady figured out, there's a whole pile of stuff going on in education. There's a whole pile of stuff going on in healthcare, in housing, and so forth. And she expanded their view. She said, we've got to step back. This isn't working, right? That's the first thing. Because when you first go in, you're going to look for the simplest solution, right? So you're going to say, well, if we just lock them up, it'll be fine, right? But if that's not working for 100 years, then you say, okay, this is not working. Let's try something else. And you have an opportunity to come in and say, it's not working because you're treating a complex issue, a systemic issue, as if it's a simple one, as if it's just like we change this and it'll fix it. And that's not the way it is. We've got to step back. We've got to deal with the complexity of this. That's the first thing, right? I'm aware and think like that, but then map these out and think about what changes we need to make, as I was saying, yeah. Yep.
It's not overwhelming sometimes?
Well, certainly, yeah. Well, it depends on your disposition and your attitude, right? Some people love complexity. Intellectuals, they love complexifying things, right? Some people love just sitting in a city and looking around them and say, wow, look at all these systems and they're interacting and somehow it's working and that's amazing, you know? Other people are like, oh my God, that thing's so scary, I want to go away from it, you know? Yeah. And you can help people, right? Because it's about our mental models. Right? If you give people mental models that allow them to, the whole systems thinking is about how do we get mental models that we can start to embrace complexity and make sense of it. Yeah. Well, lots of questions. Okay.
I was hoping, like, can you talk a bit about like reputation with the Glasgow example? Like obviously, as other example, like with homelessness, like one of the Nordic countries solved it in a way like it definitely like downed it by finding solution or like permanent housing. I was wondering like what is the success rate of reputation and how can we actually like maybe encourage it and make it better? Like if you find a solution in one part like Glasgow,
can you replicate that to another system or another, yeah, what kind of success rate?
Okay, I should be repeating all these questions for our online audience. We've got quite a few people there. What's the success rate of if we figure out something in one place, we can take it to somewhere else?
Yeah, the system is obviously different, but
Yeah.
you have similar challenges.
Yeah. Yeah, true. So complexity in general and systems thinking, it recognizes that context matters, right? So yeah, good point. Simpler problems, context doesn't matter, right? If you give me a simultaneous equation, which is actually a simple thing to solve, the context doesn't matter. I can figure out the answer and I can give it back to you. And it's the same answer here as on the moon or wherever, right? The question of homelessness, that's very different in San Francisco than another place, right? So you have to start with a recognition of that difference, but templates, models and so forth can definitely help you. And you can learn from one place and take it somewhere else, but you've got to recognize that when you take that model and interact with the real environment, it's going to be different than in another one. So I'd say it's on two levels. Yes, you can take it and you can abstract it, shall we say, and then use that abstraction in another place, but it's always going to be different in each context. You have to be kind of sensitive to that. Yeah. Okay, I'll stay going. We can take more questions at the end. So that was systems mapping. What is systems mapping? It's mapping out a system, quite simple. It's going in and saying, okay, we've got food system, right? Lots of food systems around the world need to change. I'm from Ireland. My parents are organic farmers, and there's big changes happening in the Irish food system. Partly it's due to decarbonisation is actually really the big one. People are starting to think differently about that system, for sure. But if you wanted to change it, you're going to have some representation of it, some model of it. And that's not going to be a part of equations. It's going to be something like this, because this is what a system looks like. It's elements and its relationships between those elements. So you're going to come in and you're going to draw a map to get a bigger picture view of what's going on here. So you just start with, what are the elements here, right? So there's definitely farmers there, there's people making machinery, there's government regulation, there's producers, there's supermarkets, end users, and there's many more. And you're going to put those up with a group of other people who you want to change the system with. And then you draw the relationships between them. How are they interrelated? Where's the money flowing? How's the rules and regulations flowing? Where's the information flowing? Where's the actual products flowing? So on and so forth. And then you have something of a representation of what's going on. And if you do it together with these supermarket people and these regulators, then you can start to have a discussion about what this system looks like and come to some consensus. Because if you remember, one of the big problems here was that people have very different perspectives. And that makes sense because this is a system. And these things are these are big things. Irish food system, huge thing. And this person is quite far away from this one. So they end up with one perspective. We're not getting enough money from the government. These guys end up with another perspective. We're giving them a whole pile of money and those another. When you bring them together, you've got to bring the people together, the stakeholders, all the people, get them together and have them do this exercise. And as they do this exercise, they have a discussion. Oh, I thought it was like this. No, you thought it was like that. And you start to negotiate your meanings, your understandings, and try to develop a shared understanding, a shared representation of the system. Incredibly powerful thing. Imagine if those people in America could come to a shared understanding of guns and, whether they, what that system looks like. A representation of that, because actually at the moment they live in two different worlds. These people think this about it and these people think this, and then they get together and they just shout at each other. Imagine if they had something like this. They said, oh, well, what's happening here is we have the schools here and we have the teachers here and there's a lot of guns coming in here and too much money over here. That's a basis, that's a kind of objective thing for them to start to think about changing the system, because you're not going to be able to change it until you have a shared understanding. So that's super important. You have that, you develop that map, and then as you develop that map, you can start to think about and have a discussion, what actually needs to change here and where do we need to change things? Do we need to change stuff around the supermarkets, and how do we need to connect things? Is not enough money, going to I don't know. Well, if you looked at this map in reality, what you'd see is the supermarkets, you know, they're very much in the center. They have a lot of power and so forth. And that might be a problem, you know. Maybe we need to change it by connecting the farmers more to the end users, kind of farm to fork sort of stuff. So it starts to emerge how you might go about changing that system. You obviously need to understand all the stakeholders. This is why you do systems mapping, holistic view, understand the structure, to gain people's perspectives and think about a course of action. What are the places you're going to intervene in this system to change it? So yeah, those are the things we might have something like this that's asking us about where to change stuff. After we want to go and make interventions, design and develop something that would realize those changes. I call this systems design. I'm gonna flick through for the sake of time. But you're ultimately thinking about how can we design some service or some system that kind of integrates these new innovations in a new way, a much more functional way to get new outcomes from it. And then finally, as I said, it's this kind of systems building stuff, but you've actually got to grow that new innovation, take it out there into the world, bring people into this new pattern of organization, this new way of doing things. And you've probably heard about like ecosystem building. It's becoming a big word these days. Lots of people ask me about it, and not too many people know like really what it's about or how to do it. But it's like, how do we really bring a diverse group of actors together around this new kind of system that we're conceiving of, and have them adopt this new way of doing things, start working together? And there's many dimensions to that you need to think about, like who are the actors, what's the identity of this whole thing, what's the value model, and how do we assess for impact, and so forth. So that's part of kind of scaling it in the real world, right? Building these ecosystems and trying to shift from this kind of thing. This is kind of how the world works at the moment, right? We're all in these silos and trying to shift to this more collaborative approach through these innovation ecosystems. Yeah, and we have canvases and templates and so forth. These just guides and toolkits we have on our website. You're welcome to find them there. If you have any questions, yeah. Yeah, so this toolkit here is the one, it's the full version of what I just showed you. Yeah, so this was just the highlights of it. This here is where we have all our guides on systems innovation. This is all the canvases, like I just kind of showed you, one or two, yeah, canvases that look like that. If you're going to, one organization came to us recently, they downloaded this, they're building an innovation ecosystem for climate resilient communities in Africa, and they want to use this to build that. Like, what are the parts they need in that? What's the platform they need to build? What's the function of this thing? So on and so forth. So those are the canvases, and you'll find all those on the website. Yep.
Thank you so much for the presentation. I knew nothing about a concept before, so.
Oh, wow. You just landed here, right? And did it make sense?
It did. My question is something, so I'm a psychologist and I work a lot with, I think something similar, so with very different people coming together and speaking about something and trying to solve it. And so the two things that I would love to know more about is like, what you presented for me is like very cognitive, very analytical, sort of understanding, sharing perspectives. And when I do this kind of work, like people are very emotional as well. So like when it comes to actually taking action, a lot of the times the reason why we don't do something is because we think one way and act another. So like that's one part of it. And the other is like, again, when different shareholders or stakeholders are together, like there are people in power positions and in various big social problems, reasons why things don't get done is because their interests differ from other people's, and they have more of a voice and power than others. So there, even if there's like an exchange of understandings, for now it doesn't seem to actually lead to the next step. So like how you get over the emotional part and like different power positions.
Yeah, yeah. Totally right. This is totally different in theory than in practice. When you go to do this stuff, like it's incredibly different. I was just in Amsterdam last week, actually giving the same similar presentation, and afterwards we met up. And one of the ladies was saying they're working for an NGO trying to tackle, trying to help immigrants, people who are moving into the country, get through bureaucracy. And she was saying that actually the government pretty much set up bureaucracy because they don't want these people there, right? Because when they come there, they've got to pay their bills and so forth. So they actually set up this Trump-like wall of bureaucracy instead of like a, and she was saying their NGO is trying to change the system. And she was almost ready to give up because she felt like she was banging her head against the wall for years and years, trying to change the system. You know, the government didn't want to change, right? That's the reality. That's pretty much typical of the way it will feel like if you go do this in practice, right? So I stand here, give you a theory, and like, oh, it sounds so easy. You do this, you do that, you do that. Not like that at all, right? Exactly as you say, it's all about people, and people are messy, right? That's why I had that word there, because the whole thing's totally messy. And so that's that part of it. The second part about power, yeah, it's a really important discussion, but part of my answer to that, because people always raise it, is that exactly, that's what you experience, right? Like this lady is saying, right? She was in the public sector in Mexico, and probably if you try to do anything, you bump up against all sorts of people who didn't want you to do anything, right? And that's the reality of the world we live in. And that's why I say it's about innovation. Innovation is creating something new. That's why I use that word innovation, because you've got to go out there and you've got to create something new that attracts people into this new way of doing things. I started by just putting a video on YouTube, and people started watching it. So I created another one and created another one, and keeps on going. And now we're a community of like 7,000 people around the world, and have quite a bit of influence because we grew something over time. We grew something new, and I don't have a boss. I have to say, I've got a 5-year plan and I'm going to do this or whatever. I don't have a boss, right? So I have flexibility to move and so forth. And I've created new value streams to kind of pay our bills and do all these things. So now I can go to these organizations and say, look, we've created something new. Let's get together. Let's start to do. And if you're far enough down the road, then they'll start listening to you and so forth. So that's what I mean by creating something new. So you get outside of existing structures, and you can bypass a lot of kind of power dynamics and so forth when you introduce something new. Yeah, but there's got to be a value proposition. You've got to deal with all the psychology. It's a whole part of psychology. Yeah, you're coming from a good area, actually. Yeah, yeah. Okay, guys. Anything else, or should we wrap up? Yep.
I'm wondering, with part of the things that are coming in terms of decentralization. I mean, blockchain being one, but like beyond blockchain, there's a lot of things happening. For example, there's now some corporate groups like separating into smaller, let's say, cells, so to say, or there's
networked organizations.
There's more network organizations coming. So I'm wondering if you see somehow that correlated, let's say, with system thinking, or perhaps a way of the systems evolving towards more like the 15-minute city that you were mentioning.
Yeah. So that's a very fundamental change in society and how we organize ourselves. That we've been on a transition for almost a century now, away from hierarchies to more decentralized ways of doing things, and that's a very fundamental, that systems change on a very fundamental level, right? We've been talking about fixing this problem in Glasgow or that there, but we know we have transformations happening in our world, like a lot of that's powered by the information revolution. The capacity to actually do that, to decentralize production and so forth, is transformative, and that's exactly playing in with this, right? So decentralization is a lot of this thinking. I don't know, has anybody had a complexity science or complexity theory here? Not that many. No. Okay, a couple. Well, that's all about decentralized systems. A complex system is a decentralized system. And how do you get order and coordination in decentralized systems? So a lot of people in this are interested in that question. How do we move away from centralized, hierarchical, bureaucratic ways, because they don't really work? And how do we move to decentralized systems that are much better dealing with complexity, right? The way they're organized, the way they're set up, and so forth. So that's, yes, that's a big part of all of this. It plays into it, yeah.